All right, well, now that we've talked about the sine curve, the cosine curve, we should be able to piggyback on some of those ideas. And even though it's almost exactly the same exposition, it really won't take as long because we have some of the basic ideas already that we learned about from sine. So, cosine, we're going to do the same thing. First time through the water, we're going to plot some points. Once we have the picture of the graph in our mind, then we won't need this grid anymore, just like you don't need this grid anymore for the basic shape absolute value graph or the basic shape square function graph. Now, bear in mind again what's happening with cosine. With the unit circle, that's a bad unit circle, with the unit circle, the cosine is the x coordinate. So if a point lies on the unit circle, cosine is the x coordinate. All right, so here is my coordinate system. As we've learned from before, let's go ahead and start with what we know. The y-axis, we're going to go from -1 to 1. The x-axis, we are going to once again score off in terms of pi. So here's pi, this is 2 pi, maybe this is 3 pi, this is negative pi, -2 pi. We know what's going to happen because we've already dealt with sine. This is going to be extremely similar. At x equals 0, remember that for sine, we chose the y coordinate, but for cosine, we're choosing the x coordinate. So cosine starts off at 1 rather than at 0. Cosine does not pass through the origin. The basic shape cosine curve does not pass through the origin. It passes through 0, 1. It starts at the top, not at the middle. And then the similar thing happens as we continue around the cycle. So we're going to use pi over 2, we're going to use pi, we're going to use 3 pi over 2, we're going to use 2 pi, and 5 pi over 2, just to illustrate the point. At pi over 2, the question is, what is the x coordinate? Well, the x coordinate is now 0. At pi, the x coordinate is going to be -1. At 3 pi over 2, the x coordinate is going to be 0. So we see what's happening. We're selecting off the x coordinate of all these points. So the first x coordinate is 1. At pi over 2, the x coordinate is 0. At pi, the x coordinate is again, it's at -1. At 3 pi over 2, the x coordinate is again 0. At 2 pi, we've come back up, the x coordinate is 1 again. And as we continue around the second cycle, we can see that again, the function repeats itself. The function repeats itself. And so at 5 pi over 2, it's the same as the function value at pi over 2. It's 0. And this cycle continues. Once again, the cosine curve is periodic. So it has a period just like sine does, and the graph is extremely similar. So let's plot these points, 0, 1, at pi over 2, 0. So here's pi over 2, 0. At pi, -1. At 3 pi over 2, the function value is 0. And at 2 pi, the function value is 1. At 5 pi over 2, is it clear? It's the same as it was at pi over 2. That function value is again 0. At 3 pi, it again goes down to -1, and so on out in that direction. If we play connect the dots, we get a similar curve. It's similar to the sine curve, except remember that the sine curve passed through the origin. This is actually shifted in a bit. What's happening in the negative direction? As you go in the negative, the first x coordinate you start with is at 1, at 0. But then the next x coordinate is 0. The next x coordinate is -1. So we got 1, 0, -1, 0. 1, 0, -1, 0. And then up to 1 again. And so the curve continues with this same periodic in the negative direction. And so this curve continues to cycle throughout the entire real axis. The curve never ends as you go out the x-axis positive. It never ends as you go out the x-axis negative. So similar to the sine curve, the domain is all the real numbers from negative infinity to infinity. Or if you prefer, you may write, you don't have to write both of these, one or the other will suffice. You may write all the real numbers as the double stroke r, or the negative infinity to infinity version. The range, is it clear? The range of the cosine curve is the same as the range of the sine curve. The maximum value is 1, the minimum value is -1, and those values are achieved. So the range is the closed interval from -1 to 1. If some doofus someday on an exam asks you if the range, what is the range of the cosine function, if one of the choices is the open interval, then you know that is not the correct result. The correct answer is the range of the cosine function is the closed interval from -1 to 1. All right? Again, we have the period. The period is the minimum distance over which the function repeats itself, and it's not very hard to see that that minimum distance is 2 pi. This is the period. The period of the cosine curve is 2 pi. That is the distance. If I take this piece of the picture, lift it, move it over 2 pi, and put it back in the picture, it would precisely match itself in both directions as far as we care to go. So, the period of both sine and cosine both have a period of 2 pi. The standard interval, if you're going to draw just one period, the standard interval is from 0 to 2 pi. Now, it turns out the other functions don't necessarily have that. For example, the standard interval for tangent is not 0 to 2 pi. The period for tangent is not 2 pi. The different functions have different values. And so it's important that you learn them, learn the specifics of this function for that specific function. Now, it is the case that for all these, sine and cosine, they have the same standard interval. They have the same period. They have the same domain. They have the same range. But the picture is not the same. Remember that sine passed through the origin. This is the sine curve. Right? So the sine curve is at a different place than the cosine curve. All right? Now, if we are going to draw just one period, here's -1, here's 1, here's pi. Again, that's approximately 3. Just make a rough approximation. This is 2 pi, pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. And you draw in the 5 standard points. The 5 standard points. The difference is cosine starts at the top. Cosine starts at 1, sine starts at 0. And so that's the graph of one period. That's the standard period, the standard interval. We've graphed cosine over the standard interval. So that's the graph of the basic shape cosine curve.
Some of the elderly will be willing to die, will need to die in order to save the economy. If we're headed in that direction, the president's going to need more than ever before a supportive media outlet that can spill that nonsense out to us. And we've got to keep demanding medical expertise and the truth. I'll tell you a quick story about an old Soviet defector and an FBI agent. The FBI agent was trying to help the defector acclimate to U.S. society. One day they're stopped in traffic for an hour. They see rescue lights flashing. They see a helicopter landing. The Soviet defector turns to the agent and says, "Why are we sitting in traffic for an hour? What's this about?" And the FBI agent says, "We're trying to save the life of someone who's been in an accident." And the defector says, "That would never happen in the Soviet Union, that we would inconvenience thousands to save one life." But that's exactly what we may be asked to do, and Fox News is going to have to play a role in convincing us of that.
You know, President Frank makes such a great point. I think Fiona Hill, anyone that watched the impeachment hearings, really sounded the alarms about not wanting to participate in disinformation campaigns. She was talking about a Russian disinformation campaign. Is anyone in the Murdoch family or at Fox News, are any of them concerned about the idea that they're not putting out facts all the time on their air?
You know, that was actually to me the most remarkable part of this story. You're right. So I called all these folks at Fox to ask, you know, what happened there? That was obviously a disaster. Who's in charge? The answer really seems to be nobody. Rupert Murdoch, you know, he's 89. He's in pretty good shape. Bernini, who's CEO of Fox.
We lost Ben Smith, Frank. Oh, sorry.
It doesn't seem to have the
I think we lost Ben, Frank.
just to run the network.
Come on, take control.
I apologize on behalf of all of our guests for our technical challenges. Frank Figluzzi, let me give you the last word on whether there should, it's this extraordinary time of a global pandemic that threatens all Americans with illness and many Americans with something far more grave. Should there be sort of a reality check, a reckoning, an intervention at Fox News?
Well, the question is who would do that intervention, and I think their own viewers and sponsors. Look, this all comes down to money. If we're talking about sacrificing lives for Wall Street, this is about money, and Fox will respond to that. So if there's a concerted effort to get to their sponsors and their sponsors to tell Fox, "We're off this show if you don't get to the truth about the medical planning and strategy needed to get this economy back open, we're out of here." We're going to need that more than ever.
Ben Smith, I'm fascinated by your reporting. I'd love to have you back to talk about it more. Frank Figluzzi, thank you, my friend. And if you didn't get enough of Frank here, you can catch more of him in the new Smithsonian Channel docuseries, Spy Wars. After the break, Major League Baseball's opening day was supposed to be Thursday, but like so many other American traditions, it's been postponed. A look at how the virus is affecting the world of